Hi everyone, I am really excited to welcome you today to IEAA's Emerging Researchers webinar, which is a spotlight on our emerging researchers in international education. Just in case you missed it, this session is being recorded. Firstly, and really importantly, in the spirit of reconciliation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on all of the lands from where we're gathered today. I'm joining you from the lands of the Yugambeh and Yagara people near Brisbane, near Meanjin. And I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and extend that to all of our First Nations peoples joining us today and acknowledging the contributions and the fact that they are the first learners and educators that we are learning so much from. So, as you can see on this slide, my name is Amanda Daly. I am an academic director at Griffith University, but importantly, I am the chair of the IEAA Emerging Researchers subcommittee. And I'm really excited today to be sharing with you and introducing you to two of my amazing colleagues as we explore some of their research. So you can see here on this slide, we, as a group, we've had previous webinars. So you can access those easily through that link or through the QR code. And that includes webinars that we posted over the last 12 to 24 months on having a research-related career in international education, communicating your research, and also having pathways into formal research training. Another exciting opportunity that we've got is you can connect with us, with the IEAA Research Committee on LinkedIn through that link there or through the QR code. And that's a great way to connect with other researchers, even if you're thinking about getting into research, as the if you've seen the posts on LinkedIn, you know, for those who are research curious and thinking about how you might be able to bridge that practitioner research divide, it's a great way to connect with everybody and see what else we're doing in this space. So today I am introducing you to two of my colleagues, long-term colleagues, and two members of the Emerging Researchers Subcommittee, Dr. Anna Kent and Dr. Elena Williams, or call her Ellie, please. Anna and Ellie are going to be sharing their research and their experiences and what they've been doing. Ellie is the recent winner of the now I've forgotten the exact terminology, of the PhD award, the postgraduate award through IEAA for her amazing PhD research, which she's going to tell us a bit about. And Anna was actually the award winner in 2024. So it's great to have that connection and seeing the outcomes of both of their research. I'm going to hand over to Ellie to start with, and they can introduce themselves and share what they've been doing.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Amanda. And well, good morning from here. I'm in Jakarta, but good afternoon to everybody over there. Lovely to see you all and such a great crowd for our webinar today. So thank you so much for coming along. As Amanda mentioned, I want to talk to you a little bit about what my PhD research was on, specifically looking at Australia-Indonesia relationship building through learning abroad and through scholarships. So what I was looking at really in my research, which I conducted between 2020 and end of 2024 at the Australian National University, was really framed by this kind of key research question, which I'm just trying to click through now and hopefully the slides will work. There we go. Really framed by a key question, which was how can we better understand the impact of learning abroad on students and host communities and on Australia-Indonesia relationship building? So I know some of you who are on the call today, and I'm sure many other people who are working in learning abroad, working in scholarship space as well. And I've been in this, working for Achichis, working up in Indonesia for a long time, and had heard anecdotally these stories of change and impact, but there really was a lack of data on these experiences, and particularly on Indonesian host communities. So I really wanted to understand, when we talk about Australia-Indonesia relationship building and the role of international education in that, I wanted to dig into that in a little bit more depth and understand really what was going on. So the way that I did this was really by building this up through a case study. So looking at ACICIS, which is the Australian Consortium for In-Country Indonesian Studies, or a group of Australian universities that send students to Indonesia. It's been operating for 30 years. And since the New Colombo Plan has been active, the federal government's signature scholarship for undergrad students going to the Indo-Pacific, this formed a really great case study because looking at the first 5 years of this, essentially there was around 1,850 ACICIS students at the time who were actually funded by NCP funding and supported with that funding. And given that these students came at the time from around 25 different universities, it actually represented a really good sample. So it was really representative of the differences in Australian universities, different types of students, and also different programs that they were coming up on as well. So looking at this as well, we know now that this has been a long-running program, roughly averaging about $50 million a year in the funding envelope. And we've seen now about 12,000 students who've gone to Indonesia since 2014. So what I wanted to do in terms of actually building this case study and thinking about who I would speak to, when I talk about students and host community members, I spoke to 159 people all up, and this was roughly sort of 87 Australian alumni and 72 Indonesian host community members. So the students here were coming from those member universities that I said in Australia, and they were going to programs and locations in Bandung, Jakarta and Yogyakarta, so across Java. But some of the main locations where ACICIS was running programs at the time, and across different disciplines as well. So one of the great things about the NCP is that it really expanded the disciplinary offerings that ACICIS had in country as well. So students who are studying programs, yes, in Indonesian studies and Indonesian language, but also those who were doing programs in business, creative arts, development studies, law, and so on. And when I use the term host community, I acknowledge that this is a contested term, and there's a lot of literature about that I don't have time to go into today, but you can have a read of my thesis. But when I use this term, I use it quite broadly to cover two kind of main groups in my research. The first is sort of institutional hosts. So these were people who were already aware of ACICIS or aware of the relationships that existed between the institutions. So university lecturers, staff, ACICIS staff in country, internship hosts, and so on. And the second group is more around community residents. So people who may have perhaps woken up and said, why are there suddenly all of these Australian students living in my neighbourhood? What's going on here? Neighbourhood residents, homestay families, that sort of thing. So those two kind of key groups when I talk about host communities. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay on these clicks. There we go. So let's get into it. So what did we actually find? And I say we because of COVID. I actually had to work through co-researchers up in Indonesia at the time, and it was a wonderful experience by being able to work with Indonesian researchers in this project as well. So when we look at this here, I'm just going to bring all of these up. So what I want to focus on today is sharing sort of 5 key findings with you that came out of the research. There were a lot, of course, but I want to really hone in today on just these 5. The first one is something that crops up in the literature quite a lot, which is that of increased confidence, language fluency, and intercultural competence for Australians. Okay, so we know that learning abroad has this impact on people, on young students when they go abroad. But perhaps lesser known was the impact that this was also having on Indonesians, particularly those who were in classrooms with our Australian students, those who were in internship placements, who were in boarding houses and so on. And you can see here some of the things that the Indonesians have said in response to that. Things like, well, I used to be so nervous speaking English with bules or foreigners, but our group assignments really helped me to hone my English. Or I've become the kind of go-to guy in our office whenever we work with Australian clients because they know that I was involved in this program. So one of the things the research showed me was that instead of simply looking at the impacts and the benefits for Australian students in what they would gain from learning abroad, it also expanded and extended this idea of increased confidence and so on to young Indonesians as well. And that was really quite prominent across all focus groups and interviews that came up. Secondly, drawing on the work of Professor Lee Tran at Deakin and her study on the New Colombo Plan over the last few years, is looking at this idea of mobility as becoming, so a way of becoming a grown-up, becoming a citizen of the world, and so on. And one thing I found here was that, yes, there was a tendency for students and hosts to focus here on I was becoming a global citizen. Yes, I was forging my career, I was finding my way and so on. But again, this wasn't simply limited to Australians. This also went to Indonesian young people as well. So I started hearing things that I was expecting from some of the young Australian students like Alex Darling here, who went on to be a journalist with the ABC when he got home. But things like I always knew that I wanted to be a journalist, but doing it in such a different setting showed me that I could do it. And he said that he drew on those skills all the time now when working in multicultural communities back in Australia. But when the Indonesians were saying things to me like, well, I saw Achichis just as a foot in the door, just to work in the sector as a first job, but what it actually grew to be was a cornerstone of my career. These really showed me, these sorts of comments showed me that this was actually a form of becoming for young Indonesians as well. And so that sense of identity and finding your place in the world was not limited only to Australian students who travelled, but also to the Indonesians who welcomed them into their classrooms and workplaces and communities. Now, thirdly, there's a very dense literature on the concept, I suppose, of internationalisation at home. That in, for example, recognising that many Indonesians can't travel abroad, internationalising the curriculum at home on Indonesian communities, in Indonesian campuses, is a really core part for a lot of Indonesian universities in terms of giving their students that experience of globalising the curriculum, of creating global citizens and so on. So again, I was kind of expecting to see some of this and wasn't surprised when I heard people talking about this on campuses. But it was when this also then extended off campuses that I found this was really interesting to see what was actually happening. So for example, when I would hear this from lecturers on campuses, but then also to hear this from internship hosts in businesses in Jakarta, for example, this one here at the bottom said to me, well, I was already quite familiar with working with Australians, but for our drivers and cleaners and administrative staff, they also got a chance to interact. And for them, I thought, wow, that's really something. They were forced to use their English with the student and to practice Indonesian with him. And that's where I saw the impact in our office. So when we think about this concept of internationalisation at home, often in the literature, we're looking at the way that this really impacts curriculum development, classroom approaches, teaching approaches, pedagogical approaches, and so on, and even the campus environment. But in fact, what I discovered, and particularly within the NCP, with such a strong emphasis on internships as part of the program, that this actually has the ability, and has been doing successfully, to extend off campus as well and to really create this kind of ripple effect in the community. And I certainly saw that in the internship interviews as well. The fourth finding I want to share with you was something that I wasn't expecting to see, but was also really quite prominent in all of the focus groups with Australians and Indonesians. And this was really sort of shedding new light or some new insights on the role of race, whiteness and foreignness in study abroad. So Australian students, for example, told me that they had different experiences of study abroad based on their appearance, whether they were white or non-white in their terms. Some of the white students described a sort of sensasi bule, or a kind of foreigner sensation, being the white person in the village, kind of feeling like a rock star in the village, being a guest of honour, but also being stared at with photos everywhere, catcalling, this sort of assumed wealth that you are white and therefore you are privileged. And there is that, but a lot of them really kind of didn't resonate with it because they were students, for many of them, particularly on mobility grants in the NCP. The only reason they were even travelling to Indonesia, or some of them it was their first time abroad, the only reason was because of that $3,000 mobility grant. So it was a really interesting experience for them for the first time, for many of them, to have that, the way that they appeared in the world and to have that conflated with a sense of class and status that they weren't familiar with. It was deeply uncomfortable for many of them. For some of the non-white students, they said things to me like, I felt like I wasn't getting the full bule experience, or the full foreigner experience. And instead, particularly those of Chinese Australian heritage, said that they experienced exclusion or being considered as Chinese Indonesian, which is a very loaded experience in Indonesian history and carries with it oftentimes a lot of racism, exclusion, and can be, they can experience a way of living in the world that was vastly different to what they had grown up with in Australia. So how they kind of showed up in the world was very, very different for a lot of the Australian students. And on the other hand, when we saw Southeast Asian Australian students of mixed heritage, and there were about 8 in my study in that group, they actually talked about experiences of fitting in for the first time in their life. They talked about feeling a sense of coming home, feeling part of an ASEAN family, feeling like they belonged, or the two sides of their identity suddenly made sense where they never do in Australia. So there were really vastly different experiences based on a student's appearance when they got to Indonesia, and particularly what that has to say about a history of race and colonisation in Indonesia. Now, on the flip side, Indonesians also had really interesting experiences about this as well. Many, before they met an Achichi student, held preconceptions of Australia as a kind of white, monolingual country. They thought, oh, they all speak English there, they're all Christian, and so on. But some described no longer knowing how to use the word bule, which traditionally has meant a sort of white foreigner. Now they said, well, who does that term apply to? If an Australian can be Indonesian Australian, Thai Australian, Kenyan Australian, and so on, all these multiple identities that they encountered while these students were in their communities. Many of them were surprised to learn that other students that they met could speak Indonesian, had studied it, knew about Indonesian politics and culture, but then felt a real kind of unease with that sense of surprise, saying they felt this might have been the product of a colonised mindset or an internalised racism, as 2 participants expressed it. And they really wanted to kind of correct their own thinking. So why shouldn't foreigners want to come to Indonesia? Why shouldn't they learn Indonesian? And in fact, it actually instilled a sense of pride in them that these students were coming here, but also challenged their own thinking on this. And that was really something unexpected that I hadn't anticipated seeing in the data. Now, finally, the last finding I want to share with you today is that in my research, I found that many students and hosts do not identify with the language of public diplomacy per se. Yet their actions that they were engaging with really do constitute forms of what I would call active relationship making. So, for example, students would say things to me like, well, I wouldn't really call myself an ambassador. I don't really like that word. Maybe I'm more of an advocate for the Australia-Indonesia relationship. Or another Indonesian buddy said, for me, it's more about making friendships and having that kind of impact, leaving a good impression on someone. And they would often diminish their actions and say, oh, you probably won't use this in your research, or this isn't anything big. But they then, in fact, went on to describe really significant actions in relationship building. So things such as that the Australians described, being back at their home campuses now in Australia and making Indonesians at work or on campus or out and about in the community feel welcome. They would say things like, I know what it's like to not know where you're going or not know how to get there or to be the odd one out. They had this increased sense of empathy and they wanted to stop and help people find their way. They knew what it was like to not be in a majority language country, to look different and so on and so on. They'd taken with them a passion for Indonesian language home, and many of them are now advocating for that to be reinstated on their campus amidst the multiple closures of Indonesian language around the country. They've encouraged many of their family members or friends to now take up Indonesian language learning. They've done things like volunteering with the Australia-Indonesia Youth Association or joined the Australia-Indonesia Youth Exchange Program. They described checking in with their Indonesian friends during the worst of COVID-19 and pushing back on some of the mainstream views or misperceptions of Indonesia that might crop up. Things like, it's no longer okay for me to just sit silent when that drunk uncle at Christmas is ranting about Indonesians and Muslims and this. No, it's not like that, and I'm going to say something about that now. And in doing so, they described a way that they were challenging casual, their term, racism and Islamophobia. And that was a really important step that they were doing since they'd returned home. But again, they had diminished this and said it was just something little. Indonesians likewise described similar things about challenging stereotypes among their families, correcting some of those misperceptions that their parents might have, their aunties, their uncles, other people in the community. Well, actually, it's not all white. Did you know that there are Muslims in Australia? Did you know there's lots of Indonesians who live in Australia? And so on. Many of them now, in fact, view Australia more favourably or as a destination for further study. And several of the former student buddies or interns in my study had actually gone on to study in Australia through the Australia Awards program. Teachers talked about developing more inclusive teaching practices for mature age students or for students with disabilities in their classrooms, which they hadn't really had experience or exposure doing previously. And a lot of them described this real respect for the effort that students had put into adjusting or acclimatising. noting how difficult it must have been for them to do that when it really wasn't that familiar for a very long time for that many Australians to come into Indonesian learning environments. And then finally, there was the impact on local staff in internship placements, as I described earlier. So while these actions were described by students and host communities as kind of small or nothing really big, it strikes me that these are the very kind of actions when multiplied across, I mean, I spoke to 187 people, but when multiplied across 11 years now of the NCP, this is having a significant effect in the community, from a personal level to a community level, and then spreading out to the bilateral relationship level. So if you like, sort of 3 different levels of transformation that you can see illustrated here. So looking through the kind of conclusions here, I think the 5 key conclusions I want to share with you from the research today is really that pathways through mobility as becoming are for Australian students and Indonesian young people. We've seen that learning abroad can play a significant role in shifting these perceptions that people have of each other, whether it was in a 2-week program, formerly under the old NCP structure, or now 4 weeks, or right up to full-year programs. Third, that internationalisation at home extends off campuses and goes into the community as well through that ripple effect. And that race plays a really crucial role in study abroad experiences, and we need to better prepare our students and hosts for this as well moving forward. And that finally, the experience overall and the increased empathy and mutual understanding that it led to really enables students and hosts to change the narrative, as one student described it, back in their home countries about each other. And I think that this has significant potential for future Australia-Indonesia relations at those 3 levels there that I've described. So I'll hand over to Anna in a moment. I'm just going to click to hopefully the final one there. Yes. So if you want to have a read more of this, you can click here. There's a QR code for the executive summary, which has the link to the full thesis in there as well. And I think that IEAA will share these slides with you at the end as well. But yes, thank you very much. And over to you, Anna.
Thanks, Ellie. Okay, I think we're all good. Just a slight correction to my introduction as well. I won the IEAA Thesis Prize in 2022, so not quite last year. But today I'm going to talk to you about the research project that I've been working on a lot this year. I'm just going to bring up my notes as well. So I've spent so far 8 weeks in the National Library of Australia, researching the historic links between the Australian community and international students. I entered the National Library in May this year with a pretty strong sense of what I would find and a hypothesis to prove. My hypothesis was that the community acceptance of international education, and therefore what is known as the social license of international education, was broken in the 1990s when the responsibility for international student pastoral care and welfare support was moved from community groups, where it had been since the 1950s, and into educational institutions. Okay. Hopefully this works with the slides. Okay. So to investigate this hypothesis, that's a terrible slide. I get that, but I'm trying to make a point. So I have gone through a lot of files. I have looked at boxes of records from the Australian Federation of Graduate Women, records of the National Union of Australian Students, which later became the Australian Union of Students, the papers of May Casey, the wife of Richard Casey, who was the foreign minister, the papers of a man called Sung Chung John Yoklon, a man who worked in student support and then also worked at the National Library and then became a figure in Papua New Guinea and independence, and a man called Rick Throssell, who worked for the Department of External Affairs and the Department of Foreign Affairs for many years in the education area. I have read books, papers, newspaper clippings, and listened to oral histories. I've read letters, meeting records, minutes of meetings, and more, and I've seen evidence of fights, of debates, of problems, and evidence of solutions, of options, of successes, of pettiness, and of professionalism. In a few weeks, I'll be giving a presentation at the library showcasing the amazing things that I've found in the library's collection, and a bit of a discussion of what I've found. But to give you a little bit of a preview of what I have found, or perhaps haven't found, I haven't really proven my hypothesis, but I haven't disproven it either. I have found the stories of some amazing people. I've found the names in files of many people who are still active in higher education and international education in various ways across different files. I've worked to understand how the puzzle pieces of the history of international education in Australia fit together. I have found that there was significant engagement of large parts of the Australian community with international students, both at a systemic level, so at a structural level, but also at an individual level. I thought today what I would focus on in terms of what I have found in the files that I've been looking at is the role of the Overseas Student Service. I think this is particularly relevant today as we see the latest iteration of the International Student Voice being established, the International Students Representative Council of Australia, which is one in a long line of organisations over the decades that has served as a voice for international students. So the Overseas Student Service was a section of the National Union of Australian University Students, which was known as the NUAUS, a nice acronym to roll off the tongue, which later became the AUS, the Australian Union of Students. But the OSS was set up in 1957 after several years of the NUAUS refusing to dedicate the funds needed for the service. So international students had been arriving in Australia from the late 1940s in larger numbers, from the late 1940s, but especially from 1950 when the Colombo Plan sort of opened up people's conceptions of what was possible for study in Australia. You can see from the letter on the slide there that is from the records of the NUAUS that there were clear instructions for the service. So the objects of the service were assistance in accommodation difficulties, pre-orientation preparation, information about Australian universities for overseas students before they came to Australia, assistance for overseas students, this one I quite like, assistance for overseas students to come to Australia during their vacations. So overseas students who didn't study in Australia. Liaison between international clubs and miscellaneous welfare for overseas students. I do like that that's the last one on the list. I think it helps prove my point in some ways. What's not shown on this letter, but is very clear in the records, is the difficulties of administering a program like this across institutions, across different cities and states, and with genuine difficulties in providing these services to students, especially if students didn't know about it, and particularly that number 6, the miscellaneous welfare. And perhaps most importantly, the disinterest from a lot of the NUAUS executive. It wasn't until the 1960s that an international student actually became the Overseas Student Service Director. So the man on the screen, Chev Kidson, was the first Overseas Student Director, and he, most of the OSS directors took the role for about a year and then passed it on to the next person nominated by the NUAUS executive. In the early 1960s, an actual overseas student became the OSS director. Vivian Fleming wrote in 1986 in their thesis that the OSS was, and I quote here, largely a toothless tiger. Its only official aims were the assistance of overseas students in obtaining accommodation and the lobbying of universities to obtain English classes for overseas students. For a brief period, the OSS was able to lobby on behalf of students during a period when they were receiving funds from the Department of Foreign Affairs. So the OSS during that time advocated quite strongly for changes to the ways in which international students were charged fees, their rights to protest, their rights to remain in Australia after study, and more. And it was in this advocacy that they sometimes ended up clashing with the other structure that was there to support students, which were known as coordinating committees that were largely led and run by Australians. And the OSS student and many students perceived the coordinating committees to be more paternalistic and beholden to government policies, even when they clashed with students' wishes and needs. And I think that's a really key issue in the understanding of the role of a student voice and the possibilities of a student voice. Okay. So this policy paper from 1973 advocates for the abolishing of the coordinating committee, which is the structure that the Australian community, where the Australian community provided international student support, and asked for the introduction of new committees which had an explicit purpose of serving the welfare of foreign students. So they became more focused on ensuring that there was student services being provided rather than the conflicts that existed with immigration, for example, and other levels of Australian government that were perhaps less welcoming of international students. The OSS itself became more radical as the 1970s progressed. This is a function of both changes in the politics of the countries in which the students were coming from. So there's a huge influence on the OSS from Malaysian politics and radical politics in Malaysia in the 1970s. And they were spending less time on the welfare of overseas students and more time focused on politics, both within the student union movement and around the world. That led to a big clash with the then AUS leadership and a huge falling out in the late 1970s, which I won't go into here, but has proved quite juicy to read about in the archives. What these small insights into the workings of the OSS show is that it's difficult to have an international student representative body. I've come across letters in the collections bemoaning that a student representative went home for the long holidays and never returned, not allowing any continuity of activity at that university. The OSS directors over the years are also juggling their work for the OSS and their studies, and maintaining grades was and remains a key element for an international student visa. So I think in these files, in fact, I'm sure that in these files, there are lessons and ideas that international students themselves could be looking at as they continue the incredibly important task of creating a body that will represent the voices of international students in Australia. Now, for the rest of my presentation today, I just wanted to spend a bit of time explaining how I have been able to enjoy this amazing opportunity and encourage you all to investigate the National Library of Australia collection. I am what is called a 2025 National Library of Australia Fellow. My fellowship is one of 3 of the type awarded for this year, sponsored by the Stokes family. There are other fellows supported by other donors, and 3 fellowships offered by the NLA itself. So there's fellows coming from across Australia and around the world. There's also a fellowship offered in Asian studies and one in Japan studies, which the Japan studies was not offered in 2025. As it says on the slide, the library fellowships offer experienced researchers an opportunity to undertake deep and sustained research at the National Library using the library's collections. Fellowships are available to researchers who need the on-site access to the library's holdings. So it's a chance to spend some time in the library looking at physical copies rather than trying to get digitized copies. Now, if you are someone who is still in their PhD or thinking about applying for a PhD, there are also National Library of Australia scholarships. Again, there's a variety of scholarships available, and I would encourage you to have a look at the themes to see whether there's items in the collection at the National Library that might be of use to your own research. And how did I get here? How did I know about these? How did I find out about the National Library scholarships or fellowships? Well, the project that I'm working on in the library has been bubbling in my mind for years. I did use some of the National Library collection for my PhD research, And obviously, the social license debate that we're now having in international education has given me a really great hook to kind of place my thinking about the Australian community and international students in a more contemporary frame. Historians like me are often forced to find a hook for their research in order to get funding, whether that's an anniversary. So, for example, there was a significant amount of funding around the world, if you're a researcher of war, around the anniversary, the centenary of World War One. There's been quite a bit of funding around this year, around the 50th anniversary of Papua New Guinean independence, these sort of ideas. So my hook is this contemporary problem. It also helps that I am also involved in contemporary international education sector. So the hook is also something I'm very interested in. So I applied for the fellowship in 2023 for a 2024 fellowship and wasn't successful. And while I wasn't successful, I was encouraged by the selection committee to resubmit the next year. So I did some work on my application. I changed around a few things. I tightened it up a bit, and I added some new items to the list of items that I would view. That spreadsheet a few slides ago, that's sort of, I've extended that, but when you submit an application, you put forward a list of the items that you plan to look at when you are in the library. I resubmitted my application in 2024 and was, to my great delight and surprise and worry about how I would manage the logistics of 12 weeks in Canberra, successful. Spending 12 weeks over a year in a library reading about things that I am very interested in is admittedly very much my jam. This is great. It's not for everyone, but one of the interesting things that I've experienced while at the library is the real variety of research that people are working on. A scholar I met during my first month at the library was looking at aerial photographs of the Great Sandy Desert for a project with an Indigenous community. The creative fellow this year was a poet who was using oral histories to develop a new poetry collection. And there are others who are using a variety of different parts of the collection. So, if you are thinking that there might be something that you're interested in, I would have a look at the collection. So, the National Library has a great catalogue. There's also Trove, which is the digitised element of the National Library collection, lots of newspapers. But this catalogue is has links to Trove, but also links to the physical copies. Work out if there are resources at the library. There's a huge Asian studies collection there. Work out if there is resources that you could use in your own research. Think about maybe a smaller element of your PhD project or another project and how that might benefit from dedicated time with that specific collection, and put a proposal. Applications will open next year, early next year, for the 2027 fellowships, and I'd really encourage you all to get involved. And I think Kik is going to put up a link there, but my fellowship presentation is at the start of December, on the 2nd of December. You can come along online or in person and hear more about my research. You can hear more about me talking about the overseas student service and also the coordinating committees that we're working with international students well before many of our times. So, thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Looks like I've been able to come back. So Kiralee has put the link for Anna's presentation in the chat. If you want to sign up, as you can see there on the screen, it is completely free. So that's a great way to hear a lot more. And I honestly could sit here all day and hear about both research projects because they, it's just so exciting to see the research that's coming out. So a couple of questions we've already had. The first one is for both of you, Anna and Ellie. What advice do you have for other ECRs, so early career researchers, or practitioners dabbling in research projects who finish them? How do you then stay connected to research communities, apart from, of course, the Early Emerging Researchers subcommittee?
I can jump in. I was going to say that, Amanda. I was going to say everyone should join the Emerging Researchers group, obviously. No, but in all seriousness, the Emerging Researchers group has been great. We started this, I think it was in 2021. Correct me if I'm wrong, Amanda. 22. Gosh, the
I
time is
don't
flying.
know. I like when Anna said, oh, it was actually 2022. I was like, it
No,
doesn't seem
it's
that long
fine.
ago. Yeah.
But I mean, to do that, to have that kind of connection with other researchers through my PhD and then towards the end of the PhD, and now to be able to kind of give back to this group as well, has been really great. And just to keep connected. And, we do webinars like this, but we also hear a lot about, Anna's just shared that link to her session. People share other links to grants that are available, to sessions that are coming up, to prizes, awards, all sorts of things that are happening. So you can stay connected to that sense of a community and a research community. Particularly for me, I'm sort of research practitioner, so I like kind of being in both worlds. But for me, it's a great way to connect through the Emerging Researchers group, particularly because international education research is so multidisciplinary. When I go, and if I do go back to my kind of disciplinary camps and I'm in anthropology, or if I go to political science, they're different opportunities. But for international ed, that's my happy place. So definitely I would push the Emerging Researchers group even more so. But Anna, what about you?
Yeah, I think the emerging researchers group is a great option. I can't even speak. But other things that I would encourage you to do, I think I've really benefited from connections with different groups. I'm a historian, and so I'm connected with the Australian Historical Association and other historical organisations and bodies. And so I think there's real value in the breadth, like the value that I see in international education research is that I am a historian researching in international education, but I'm connected in a whole lot of different ways. And I think that ability to have a broad network really helps me to see and find opportunities and connect with different people in different ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, for each of us, as Ellie said, each of us are coming into international education with our own discipline background. So you've got that connection, and that's what makes it so exciting to see, as I think Philip said, about the human side to all of this big sector that we're in. Julie has asked how to join the Emerging Researchers group. So I don't know, Kiralee, if you want to put a link in there and some information. Oh, no. Hillary's already answered it. Right, so another question. So if you've got questions, please post it in the Q&A down the bottom. So another question. This one is for you, Ellie. From what you saw in your interviews, what do you think is important in ensuring ongoing positive outcomes from mobility programs, and what patterns did you see in those who described positive outcomes?
That's a great question. I think I saw that in there as well. Thanks, Lucy, for the question. Yeah, this is really interesting. I think probably in reflecting on this, one of the things that really stood out when it was a positive outcome was when there was a genuine sense of reciprocity between students and hosts, or sending institutions and host institutions, if you like. So, for example, when I would speak to, the slides that I had in there about the internship host, and before that on the internationalisation at home slide, where I was talking about what lecturers had said on campuses and how they were finding the experience. But one of the things I found really interesting was that when they felt included in the design, included in the selection of participants, included in the evaluation piece at the end of each semester, working with the teachers to actually say what worked, what didn't work, when they felt a part of the conversation, not only did A, they want to come back again next semester and keep hosting, but B, they were actually then able to find a way that this could work for their students. So I think it's not, when there's that feeling of, and particularly I know of cases where this has happened in the NCP, but when there's a feeling that the learning abroad experience or the NCP experience is largely transactional, it's often not been a positive experience, right, for host communities. So I think when there's, on the other hand, when there's a very much a distinct feeling that it isn't like that they are getting something out of it for their students, that it's more than that it's particularly longer lasting. These are relationships that are going to be built for the long term, not just for a random 2-week tour or a short term something that doesn't go anywhere. But when that university from Australia keeps sending students again and again and again, year after year after year, that really matters. And I think in particular when the universities and their students as well have a say in that, that's really important as well. So just to give a small example, one one thing that that lecturer in Bandung in West Java did say to me at the time was, okay, so we recognise the NCP is not two-way, it's not an exchange in the traditional sense, so we can't send our students to Australia, but at least in hosting the Australian students, we want to make sure that there is something in it for our students. So not just kind of having classes together or becoming buddies together, but they actually designed sort of internship programs together, they designed learning, work integrated learning programs together, where their students also could get credit for doing that work with Australian students. So I think being really creative about it and being creative with your partners in Indonesia or whichever country you're working in, to say, how can we actually make this deeply and truly reciprocal so that our partners are not feeling like, it's just transactional.
Excellent. Thank you. So Lucy's posed another question. She's directed it at you, Ellie, but I think it actually applies to anyone who's done a PhD. And it can apply to Anna as well. If you could do a follow-up project to your PhD, not another PhD, for those of us who have a manila folder or in the olden days, manila folder where you put your ideas, what aspects would you focus on next? And where do you want to go deeper or connect to further action? So like, as you were talking, I was already thinking, oh, I could do what you're talking about and then keep with my thing. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, great question, Lucy. And you're absolutely right, Amanda. I've got a folder on my desktop, just like ideas, are things I just throw in there. For me, it would be going probably deeper on the host community aspect. It's really still under-researched in the literature, looking at maybe it's not just Indonesia, but looking at other places in the New Colombo Plan or in different scholarships as well. How do other host communities around the world, and typically we're talking about communities in the global south, how do they experience global north migration, temporary migration to their communities? What are they getting out of it? What are the kind of colonial repercussions? Is that reproducing senses of colonialism and so on? There's lots of questions that I want to ask there using sort of decolonized lenses and things like that. That would be one. But even someone was just asking me this last week, and I was like, oh, if you had all the money in the world and what you could do in your research, of course, I would love to actually stretch this out and make it a longitudinal study and follow the same group 10 years from now and go back and revisit all the interviews and the focus groups and say, hey, how are you feeling now? Like, I want to look at this idea of a ripple effect in the community that I talked about, but how does that track 5-10 years on?
Yeah. Anna?
This is a very real question for me. So this is kind of my first real project out of my PhD. My PhD was looking at scholarships to the Pacific Australian Government scholarships. So I've kind of broadened my focus away from just scholarships, looking more broadly at international education. I have a grand plan of writing a history of international education in Australia. That's kind of like the big project in my head. But the experience at the library has actually shown me a whole raft of other kind of directions that you could take this research. There's a whole conversation about the people who were involved. You talk about host communities, Elena. Like the idea that the host community of Australia is very under-researched as well. There's some conversations about the Rotary, and there's some work about the organisations like Rotary and how they accepted or worked with international students in the past. But there's a whole huge number of people who are kind of invisible in that conversation, particularly women. There is a whole lot of women that were involved in supporting international students. I have another hypothesis on this one, but because in the 50s and 60s to have an international life was very difficult, particularly for women. A lot of these people are people who either came to Australia having had an international experience and they're wanting to maintain those connections to the outside world, or people who desired an international experience. So I've been looking through the Graduate Women's Association files, and there's a whole lot of women there who were kind of cutting edge in that they were graduating from university in the 50s and 60s before many women were doing that on a regular basis. And they wanted to maintain that kind of broader worldview that they were able to begin or continue during their university study. And interacting with an international student was a way to do that. And I think there's a whole lot there about, Australia and isolation and the White Australia policy. There's a whole lot in there. So that's one sort of area that I'm really interested in kind of thinking more about, because I do think the choices that Australians made to become involved with international education is quite interesting, especially given the White Australia policy that was kind of overwhelming in our immigration setting at the time.
Mm.
And I've got more, but I'll leave it at that.
It's in that folder, the growing folder.
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just going to jump to another question for you, Ellie, about you had unexpected findings like on race.
Mm.
The other unexpected findings that came up.
Yeah, there were. I mean, it was really interesting. And this is one of the great joys of qualitative research that, you can go into a focus group or an interview with an idea of how that conversation might go. You think you've got the background and the data of, these people and this is who they are and they studied in this program in this city and therefore blah. No, like every single focus group that I ran was completely different. I had the same questions for every single group, and yet every single conversation was completely different and went down a different path. So I think one of the findings in Australia, I'm just thinking back to a focus group that was in Australia that completely went down its own course was, and again, not by design, but as it turned out, so there was 5 participants in this group, 4 of whom identified as queer, and they all started talking about, we said, well, what is Indonesia to you now? Like before you went, what were your preconceptions? What is your idea of Indonesia and Indonesians now? And they started talking about it being family and it being a sense of a queer community and it being a sense of advocacy and identity, and these networks and linkages that they've built up is very much about queer community. And I loved that because that was just not expected at all, but came out very specifically to that group. Another one in Indonesia was all about, people just didn't agree with, necessarily the positivity in the community. There was a couple of people from NGOs who'd had quite negative experiences with students coming in. They talked a lot for sort of half the conversation about white saviorism, and they talked about, the kind of the NGOization of Indonesia. And that was a fantastic addition to the discussion because no one else had said it before. And that was a really, really particular point from the development sector. So again, like having seen that in other literature from development studies, it was really, really enriching to see that come out in the data as well. I'm totally not expecting that. So yeah, it was, again, there's no such thing as a same focus group across different groups.
Yeah, that's the exciting thing of qualitative research. Numbers there. Right. So Mohammed has asked for someone at the start of their PhD, congratulations, which programs or networks like IEAA's Emerging Researchers Group would you recommend joining early? Ooh. So Anna, I might start with you this time. Yeah. What would you recommend? And then we'll jump to Ellie.
That's a good question. Well, I think start at your institution. So network within your institution, speak to your supervisor about what sort of professional networks they belong to or industry networks. Because I think you can join a whole lot of things, but it depends on whether you make it work for you as well. And working with your supervisor is a good way of seeing if that's the direction, if you're kind of looking to follow that kind of career path, the academic career path, that's probably a good way of going through. I think we're really lucky at Deakin. We have a Centre for Contemporary Histories, and I've been a part of that for my whole PhD. And that group has a really active group of graduate researchers, PhD students, as well as a really strong group of ECRs, as well as the broader like academics, MCRs and professors and so forth. So I'd start at your institution, look to see where you can find local before you join or before you start getting involved more broadly. There are so many different kind of groups. There's the IEA Young Professionals as well, which is another group that you might want to think about. But yeah, I think if I was to have my time again, I'd definitely stay in the IEAA Emerging Researchers space or the IEAA space, but also think about my institution as well.
Yeah. Ellie?
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I would also add cast a very wide net in the first year. You can always then leave groups that aren't working for you, or, maybe they're not giving you what you need, and that's absolutely fine. But in that first year, really kind of experiment with what's around, what's available. Start locally, so start at your university, and that can be, there might be discipline-specific groups. So, for example, I was at ANU, we had an anthropology group, we had an Indonesian studies group, we had a political science group, and so on. Join all of those, whether they might be organising just seminars or, like in anthropology, we had a weekly anthropology seminar group on a Monday. So I would go to those and you're meeting with people, and then that spun out to let's create our own writing group. And so that was a PhD writing group and so on. In Indonesian studies, it was once a month, but you got to meet with broader people who were all working on Indonesia, but they were from different disciplines across the university and so on. For me, I was also during COVID, but I think it's still relevant now, online opportunities. So one that was really, really good for me was the Asian Studies Association of Australia and the postgraduate network there. So I don't know what field your research is in, but if it's Asia related, highly recommend ASAA's postgrad group. You can find them on Facebook, you can find them through their website. Maybe Kit can pop that in the chat there as well, but the Asian Studies Association of Australia. That's a really good one for their postgrad networks. They also do a postgraduate day at their conference, which is really great every 2 years. Depending again on what you're working on, but another group that I loved in my PhD was the Sydney Southeast Asia Centre. They do a lot of support for PhD students through, again, postgraduate development days, writing workshops, clinics, and so on. But I think it's about being open to all of the different things, recognising that, it's not going to be perfect with every single group, but having that wide network that you can really draw on when you need them as well. Sometimes I want to connect with the anthropologist and understand this particular theoretical debate, and other times I want to just talk with Indonesianists to get what I'm trying to say from an Indonesian perspective. So working out, those spreads between discipline and theme.
Yeah, and I think your point about writing groups as well, Ellie, is really good because Shut Up and Write groups, like most of them are done via Zoom these days. And if you can find out one, I know like the Australian Historical Association has an ECR one. I'm part of a different one. There's institutions often run them, but they are a really great way of having connection without it being too onerous on having to be somewhere, or, you can just do it from home.
Yeah.
But that discipline, like of having it, if you're good at the discipline part of it, having like this block of time that you're kind of accountable to others in a way that is not like super high pressure, but can be really helpful when you're doing a PhD.
I agree. I'm just chuckling because I've always found the name so aggressive. It's like, shut up and write. How about have a cup of tea and write? Like, let's just be nice to each other.
Yes, I did hear today people were talking about shut up and email and shut up and work, and so they were like, adding everything on.
Yeah.
One other one that I wanted just to plug that was really useful for me when I was doing my PhD was ISANA, International Education Association. Yeah. So my research was also around student mobility. So they were a great resource to connect and to be able to have an in connection, I guess, to gather my data through institutions as well. So it depends on what your area of specialty is. There is one last question there, but I think we're going to be out of time because it's quite an in-depth question. So I'm not sure who's posted it. Just says anonymous. It may be best for that person to reach out to you, Ellie, because it's
absolutely
quite an in-depth thing about Achishis and our relationships and things. So
perfect.
Whoever that was, please feel free to email Ellie and you can have a discussion offline.
Yes.
So if we can just see our next slides. There we go. So if you are interested in research, we do have the research committee, which we're always looking for new members. Kira Lee's just put something in there about contributions to IEAA Insights. Both Ellie, Anna and Alison have contributed this year. We have our Emerging Researchers group. We have a data group that meets very regularly as well. So you can learn more about it by going to IEAA's website, which is listed there, or you can contact Kira Lee, or as we all call her, Kik, via that email address there. And you can see how you can join and connect. And then, if you're able to, always going to the AIEC, the International Education Conference, which this year was in Canberra, is a good way to connect with people. Gabrielle's just put some information there for us on the panel that looking for ongoing research, and that's often a great way of connecting through LinkedIn and sharing what you're doing and saying, hey, I'm interested in this. Like, as Ellie has been talking, I've just had an idea of how some of her work might connect with my work. So, Ellie and I have been working together for years, and it's only just today that's come across my head.
We'll have to have a chat after this then.
We will. So I'd just like to thank everybody for coming along today. This recording will be available later on the website, which we gave earlier, where you can see previous recordings. And hopefully you can join us again next year when we have other sessions on different topics. And we're going to be making this a regular thing, that our emerging researchers are going to be giving the opportunity, the platform, to be sharing their work, which I think is a really exciting way as well to build those connections and those networks, whether you're starting your PhD, whether you're a practitioner, or whether you are a bit older like me and have been in the field for quite some time. So thank you everyone for joining. Have a wonderful afternoon or rest of your day if you're in Indonesia like Ellie, and hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, Amanda. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.